Okay, so we're going to start our series of lectures on forests of the Southeastern coastal plain. So it's a really wonderful topic that I'm really excited to dive into with you now that we've finished our morphology lectures. We'll actually get to learn about some of the forest types where some of the species live that we're learning in lab. So forests of the Southeastern coastal plain is where we're going to start. And for this module, we'll do several different forest types of the Southeastern United States, and then the last module will be about forest types around North America. So today's trivia to kick us off, what tree is celebrated as the official North Carolina toast? Okay, so that's longleaf pine, Pinus palustris, the species that we will learn in lab if we have not already. And also the highest civic honor that you can earn in the state of North Carolina is called the Order of the Longleaf Pine. If you were to win this honor, you get the privilege of being allowed to deliver the toast, which should be familiar to many of you. Here's to the land of the longleaf pine, the summer land where the sun doth shine, where the wheat grows strong and the strong grow great. Here's to down home, the old North State. That's the very first part. There's several verses of our state toast. So today's focus is going to be, we'll talk a little bit about an overview of forest types of the Southeastern coastal plain, because we'll have this lecture and then we'll have another one. Today we're going to focus on longleaf pine, loblolly pine, and slash pine. They have somewhat similar factors and attributes, so it's a good place to focus. And we'll talk about the species composition of these forests, the forest structure, environmental factors, and disturbance regimes. And this is kind of the same format that we'll use for many of the forest types lectures that we learn, as much as we can learn about each of the forest types in this course. So today's focus is on longleaf pine, and there's a really interesting and rich history of longleaf pine in the state of North Carolina. So that's something that we're going to spend a little extra time on today. And photo on the right is of a former student, alumni Pete McNeary, in the Croton National Forest among a longleaf pine forest and also pitcher plants. So when we're looking at forests of the Southeastern coastal plain, we're talking about the tidewater area, but also longleaf and our loblolly and slash pine forests go into both the inner and outer coastal plain, but that's what our focus is going to be. And the coastal plain region, if you look at the Southeastern evergreen forest, this is a forest type that was mapped by Emma Lucy Braun right around the 1950s, right before American chestnut disappeared out of our forests because of chestnut blight. And if you look at this map, you can see in yellow the Southeastern evergreen forest, and that is the forest type that we're going to focus on today. It extends from the James River out to eastern Texas, although you can see that most of Florida is left out of that with its semi-tropical climate. And most of these forests have evergreen trees, pines, as the dominant species. Of course, their distribution is patchy, so there's other forest types represented as well that aren't shown on this kind of broad scale map. The soils in these forest types are mostly consist of ancient and old sand dunes. So there's lots of sand in these soil types, also some silts and clays. Sometimes these areas have deep organic soils, but that's not something that pines tend to like, or at least the pines that we're going to talk about today. So when we talk about our forest types, we want to learn more than just the one Southeastern evergreen forest, which I think if you drive around the coastal plain, you'll see that it doesn't always have pine forest. There are other forest types too, and so I want to dive into that a little bit. But for the most part, and you can look at these forests, as I said in the last lecture, in quite a lot of detail if you really want to. For our purposes, we'll learn between 5 and 7 types, and today's focus will be longleaf, loblolly, and slash pine. But we'll also have a chance to learn about maritime forests, cypress gum swamps, precosins, Atlantic white cedar, and bottomland hardwood forests. If you're in the Forest Communities class as part of Forestry Summer Camp next summer, you're going to learn about these in a lot more detail. And for each of the forest types, we'll focus on some important factors. In the coastal plain, that would be hydrology, microtopography, soils, and disturbance. And these are major factors that separate these types. So why are these forests grow where they do? Usually it's one or more of these factors that separates them into different types. And by microtopography, we mean just very subtle differences in the landscape. You wouldn't call it elevation on the coastal plain because it's mostly flat. So is hydrology a factor in southeastern coastal plain? This is a map from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And you can see the wetland areas are shown in green. So hydrology is definitely a huge factor. Flooding, especially how long sites are flooded, and the depth of water can affect and dictate what kinds of trees can grow there. So hydrology is definitely one of the most important factors in the southeastern coastal plain forests. And today we're going to, first I'll talk about the characteristics that these pine forests share, and then we'll separate out the different types and talk about their differences. So all of these forest types, loblolly, longleaf, and slash pine forests, have a pretty wide range of hydrology. So it can be very seasonally wet, but also can be fairly dry. And we'll look at a couple types separated by those factors. They always favor mineral soils, so you don't typically see any of these species growing on organic soils. And these are early successional species. They are shade intolerant. So if you go into a pine forest, maybe you've been out to Schenck a few times now with dendrology and other classes, you'll notice that in the canopies where pines are dominant, there are no little baby pines in the understory, right? They can't regenerate in their own shade. So these pines are either naturally regenerated or also planted in plantations. And they do require disturbance. The disturbance is one break that factors into what type of forest you're going to have. So frequent fire cycles are what longleaf pine is adapted to. We'll talk about that more in a moment. And if you have fire suppression on a site, which has been the default for hundreds of years, you'll have a loblolly pine and slash pine forests. These are extremely valuable timberlands. So this is the wood basket of the southeastern United States, is supported by especially loblolly and slash pine. And all of those species are sold as southern yellow pine. So if you go to Home Depot to buy them and buy southern yellow pine, it can be any of these species. And we'll talk about longleaf pine a little bit separately because it is quite a different forest and even looks different to the outside. So southern yellow pine, as I said, the lumber can come from the species we talked about, and also shortleaf pine, which is not a coastal plain species. And it has reddish yellow to reddish brown sapwood, or heartwood color rather, and then the sapwood is a whitish yellow. And it is extremely valuable. So most of the lumber in the Southeast, well, most of the lumber in the United States comes from the Southeastern United States and comes from one of these species. And that's an interesting historic note. Before, the Pacific Northwest provided the bulk of our wood products, but after the Forest Service shut down habitat in the Pacific Northwest for the northern spotted owl, our need for wood products did not go away, but it shifted harvesting pressure to the Southeastern United States. So a lot of the products, you've learned some of these in lab, right? So dimension lumber, pulp is really important, plywood, poles and pilings, but also pine straw mulch. And this is a particularly valuable product for longleaf pine. And then it has been important historically. So you can buy pine needle baskets in many different Native American arts, and also naval stores, which we'll talk about more in a moment. Things like railroad ties that are not very important anymore, molding, agricultural impact, implements, boats and ships, and also paving blocks. So a number of different products can be made from these species. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about slash pine. This is the one that we get to learn probably the least about. And it is in the southern end of the southeastern evergreen forest. So you can see that North Carolina, you might notice that the little counties that are highlighted here are bluish green. That means that slash pine has been planted, but it is not naturally occurring. And so naturally occurring, it is in most of Florida, some in South Carolina and Georgia, also Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. And it looks a lot like loblolly pine. And we will learn this in lab if we haven't already. There's a couple of trees outside and behind Biltmore Hall, and you probably, if you've walked by it before, you may have not realized that it was slash pine. but there's a few that are planted there. It is a fire, like loblolly pine, it's a fire intolerant species. So if it grows in an area where there has been fire, if fire has not been in the landscape recently, it will start seeding in. So it is fairly invasive on sites where fire has been suppressed. And it co-occurs with oaks, and then on wetter sites, it co-occurs with sweet gum and red maple. Like our other southern yellow pines, it has to have mineral soil, and it's shade intolerant and commercially very valuable. You can tell it apart from loblolly pine by the cones, which have a little bit of a sheen on them, almost like they're varnished. They tend to be reddish, and the foliage is slightly longer than loblolly pine. And if you look at the range maps for longleaf pine here on the left, loblolly pine on the right, you can see there is overlap among these species in addition to slash pine. There's something going on. So these are herbarium records, so records of the species in herbariums. And I don't think there's good collection records for Georgia, and that's why there's definitely more coverage there than is shown in these maps. So, but you'll notice that Georgia doesn't have a lot of herbarium records for these species. If you look at longleaf pine, it is truly a coastal plain species. There's not many, there's a few rare sites in the mountains that have longleaf pine, but for the most part, it hugs the coastal plain. Loblolly is a little bit more widespread, also goes more widespread west of the Mississippi River, and extends all the way up into Delaware, where it's still naturally occurring. And the range of loblolly pine has really extended because of its extensive use in plantations. So that means there's lots of seed that's nearby that ends up spreading naturally through natural regeneration. So let's talk a little bit more about loblolly pine. It is our most important commercial species in the United States, but traditionally it didn't have as extensive as a range. It sort of followed along rivers where there was where it was protected from fire. It is not a fire tolerant species. And these extensive plantations, as I was mentioning, mean that it's more prevalent in the landscape and tends to seed in. So today in Raleigh, if you have you may have seen places that were cleared or fields that have gone vacant. Loblolly pine is what comes in, mainly because the seed is so prevalent in the area and because we don't burn these sites anymore. It does grow much faster than longleaf pine, which is why it's favored for plantations. And there's been a ton of research on the silviculture, how to grow it best, and also improve genetics. So at NC State, we have the Tree Improvement Co-op that works on genetic trials. We also have the Forest Productivity Co-op that looks at how to increase the speed of loblolly growth. So you'll learn maybe more about loblolly pine than you ever wanted to know in your classes here at NC State. Loblolly pine co-occurs with many species on naturally regenerated sites. So if you have a pine plantation, those other species tend to be suppressed. They either hack them out or herbicide or both. But on wetter sites, it co-occurs with red maple and sweet gum and water oak. What mix of species you have on a given site really depends on site moisture. And unlike longleaf pine, it forms dense and closed stands. So you can see that the canopies are closed, they're touching each other here, that like the other southern yellow pines requires mineral soil and full sun, so it is shade intolerant. And we have lots of natural regeneration. One of its common names is old field pine, because that's the species that you get when you are abandon a field and let it go fallow and don't do anything with it. And it's also planted extensively in plantations. And if you don't harvest the pine, it will eventually succeed into a pine mixed oak forest. And then from there, the pines are shorter lived than oak species, so they will die out and the stand will become an oak hickory forest. And we'll talk about that more in our Piedmont lecture, because that's a really important successional pattern that we see in the Piedmont. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about longleaf pine. So this is a really special pine. Scientific name is Pinus palustris. It was formerly the dominant pine of the southeastern coastal plain, occupying 90 million acres in the Southeast. And today we're going to talk about and separate and recognize two different main types of longleaf pine forest. We'll learn many, many more in forest communities. And if you work for a place like the Natural Heritage Program, they recognize, I think, 16 different kinds of longleaf pine forest. But we're going to look at two, and those are separated by site moisture. Savannas have a grassy understory, no midstory to speak of. So picture an open canopy of longleaf pine with a very grassy understory. And then flatwoods, what we call flatwoods, and these are much drier sites and they have a shrubby understory. So at first glance, you can see which type is which just by looking, is it primarily shrubs in the understory, which gives you flatwoods, or is it primarily grassy, and that is savanna. Both of these types require frequent low intensity fires, and longleaf has special adaptations to survive fire. It has the one characteristic is this grass stage, which you can see here on the right. And so for many months, sometimes years, longleaf pine seedlings will sit in this grass stage, which looks like a little tuft of grass growing out of the ground. And it's waiting for the right conditions before it shoots up into the canopy. At this stage, it is very resistant to fire. I'll talk about that more in a moment. And then once it reaches, if it's able to reach the canopy, it is quite a long-lived species. So something that's a very different life history strategy than either loblolly pine or slash pine. So some of the fire adaptations, we just talked about the grass stage. It has really long, lush foliage. So in lab, you're going to learn, if you haven't already, the longleaf foliage can be as long as your forearm, so 12 to 18 inches maybe, which makes it extremely valuable for pine star raking. And the adult trees that have gone through the grass stage and shot up into the canopy have extremely thick bark, which is fire resistant. That's true of many of our pines as they get older. Longleaf is adapted to a fire interval of every 1 to 3 years. So we're talking about very frequent fire. I'm going to show you what that looks like in just a moment. And really, longleaf is a tolerator of fire. So it doesn't thrive on fire necessarily, but it is adapted to survive fire. And that's important because longleaf pine is a terribly poor competitor. So almost any species can outcompete it. And so the fire really acts as a way to get rid of other species that it competes with. Like our other southern yellow pines, longleaf pine is shade intolerant. And so you can see here, this is a tree that is just coming out of the grass stage. You can see the long white bud. This is actually a really important ID characteristic. They look like little candles, especially in spring when these buds from the apical meristem start to elongate. And then I don't have all of the foliage in this photo, but you can see that long, lush foliage also helps protect the bud. So on these sites where you have frequent fire, often after a prescribed burn, you'll go into the site and almost all the foliage has been completely toasted off, but that fleshy white bud is still intact. This is what one of these prescribed fires looks like. One thing you can notice is that, first of all, this is a grassy understory, so we would call this a savanna. And the flames are low. They're not leaping up into the air. They're certainly not getting up into the ground. Longleaf pine has no ladder fuel, so it has these very straight boles. It tends to self-prune. And so these fires stay low and kind of burn the understory. So if there's any shrubs or tree seedlings like oaks, they will get toasted in this fire. And so this is how longleaf prevails. These savannas can be incredibly diverse places, and they're incredibly important for conservation. What's interesting about longleaf pine savannas is that they have the greatest species diversity on very small scales. And so, you know, when you're looking at this forest, I think you can see in the photo that the trees, there's only one type of tree represented. So if you wouldn't call it a diverse forest, it's certainly not a diverse forest canopy, but the understory is incredibly diverse on these sites. And so if I was to take a hula hoop and throw it out into the forest here, I might count as many as 80 or 90 species within that hula hoop, different species of grasses and herbs. So these sites are some of the most diverse in the world on this small scale. This is another site. This is the Wells Savannah, and you can see carnivorous pitcher plants, and these red dots are flowers of the pitcher plants. So just an incredible place to see. This is in North Carolina. And then grass pink orchids, calopogon. I don't know which species this is, probably pallida, that's here on the right. So these can be incredibly diverse and can have incredibly beautiful wildflowers. This is my gratuitous animal photo. There are also several species that call longleaf savannas home, namely the gopher tortoise, which is not found in North Carolina. It's found in southern South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. And then the red cockaded woodpecker, commonly called RCWs, which are found all over the southeastern United States, that depends on longleaf pines. Interestingly, it's the only species of woodpecker that makes its home in the living canopy of these trees. And so the tree, when they make their longleaf pine, is susceptible to heart rot. And so the inside of the tree can die, which helps the bird hollow out these cavities for its home. It is a cavity nester like other woodpeckers. But the live tree tends to put out resin where it's damaged, and that resin acts to protect the birds from species of snakes that might come up the tree and eat their offspring. So really an incredibly interesting dynamic. We're going to switch gears and talk a little bit about flatwoods. So at first glance, this looks very similar to our savannas. But if you look a little bit more closely, these sites tend to have an understory of shrubs instead of grasses or herbaceous plants. And these sites are drier. That's what defines a flatwood versus a savanna. So much drier sites. This photo on the right shows what I call a teenager longleaf pine in all of its awkward glory. So the pine will sit in the grass stage for sometimes years, and then when conditions are right, it shoots up and grows very, very rapidly to try and reach the canopy. This is a stage where it is vulnerable to fire because the bark is not very thick, but it does grow at an extremely rapid rate and has this sort of Dr. Seuss look about it. This is a stand of a pine flatwood and what it looks like if fire is suppressed. So my friend and colleague Rob Evans, who used to work for North Carolina Plant Conservation Program, took this shot, and it just shows how, longleaf is just a really crummy competitor. And so these different shrubs have grown up and they're taking site resources away from the canopy trees. There's undoubtedly a mix of oaks in here as well. And if they shade out the longleaf seedlings, they will not have a chance. There's no way that longleaf pine will reestablish in a site such as this. Probably your best bet would be to take out and thin some of the canopy trees and then try to remove the understory and then burn it a lot. These flatwoods can have on different appearances. This is one on the left is taken in Florida, and it's got I can tell that because the understory is sable palmetto, which is interesting and different from what we have here in North Carolina. And this is a very old stand, which I can tell by the flat tops of the longleaf pines. They tend to flatten out when they get older. This stand on the right is crying out for fire. You can see there's a mix of oak species in here. There's some sassafras that I can see. Again, this is a site that really needs restoration. And in this case, restoration would look like thinning the canopy trees and species that you don't want, some of the oaks, and then conducting several pretty frequent prescribed fires to try and knock down that shrub layer. Some of the competing species in the sandhills, the most important competing species is turkey oak. This is Quercus latus. Some years we get to learn this in dendrology, but not all of them. And you can see this is occupying very, very xeric or dry sites in the sandhills. You can see the open ground with sand here, and how these turkey oaks are taking over pretty rapidly. So these little longleaf pines in the understory really don't have a chance once turkey oak gets established. So I want to talk a little bit more about longleaf pine and its history. We talked about its natural history, but also its cultural history. So this is, again, the range map, the historic range of longleaf pine, Pinus palustris. And then this current range, this is provided by the Longleaf Alliance. And so these very largest dots, the the largest dots represent 1 million acres, right? So recall that at the height, a long time ago, longleaf pine occupied 90 million acres. And so each of these largest dots are 1 million acres. There's only one place left where that is the case. And if we zoom in on North Carolina, there's only a few sites where longleaf pine is the dominant species. And that is Fort Bragg, which might surprise you a little bit, but Fort Bragg, having a military presence and conducting military exercises, has excellent use of fire on the ground. And so those sites end up getting conserved and maintained. Also, the Bladen Lakes area and Jones Lake State Park, right? That's our other main place where longleaf pine grows. A little bit in the Hoffman Forest, which is owned by NC State. And these light green areas are federally owned lands. These are all on organic soils up here in the northern part of the coast. And we'll talk about those forest types later. This is the Croatan National Forest in Onslow and Carteret County. And this other large dot here, this is the Francis Marion National Forest, which is where my husband is from in Berkeley County, South Carolina. So why is longleaf pine so rare these days? A couple of different reasons, really 4 main reasons of how we've impacted longleaf pine over time. First, this seems like a strange reason, but hogs were allowed to graze wild during colonial times and by settlers, and hogs love those fleshy and starchy buds of longleaf pine in the grass stage. So a lot of longleaf pine was impacted by grazing hogs in the early part of the colonies. And then, of course, as soon as people arrived here from Europe, they decided that longleaf pine, if we wanted to protect the forest resource, that we should not burn it or allow it to burn. And so basically, since colonial times, we've had a policy of fire suppression. So putting out fires all the time, right? So if the species needs fire, it is going to go into decline. So forests are become very dense, and longleaf pine can't survive. And then a couple of commercial uses. One, the naval stores industry before the Civil War was an incredibly impactful on longleaf pine forests. And then following the Civil War, land conversion and land use, right? Just extensive timbering of longleaf really took out a lot of the forest in the South. So let's talk a little bit more about naval stores, right? So this is where our nickname, the Tar Heel State, comes from. So when we're talking about naval stores, this is tar, it's pitch, turpentine, and rosin. These are all things that are made from pine sap. So we're talking about naval stores. We're not talking about stores where you can go shopping for Navy themed apparel. It's an industry that supported shipbuilding, particularly shipbuilding in the English colony or in England. So longleaf pine was the best and most abundant source of these products, and so it was harvested extensively. Major export during colonial times to support the British Navy. So they were tasked, the colonies were tasked with providing these naval stores, and bounties were paid to produce naval stores. So North Carolina was the epicenter of the naval stores industry, producing over 90% of the naval stores at one time. And because of the labor changes, the industry completely collapsed after the Civil War. And also the trees were pretty much decimated by then. So I want to show you what this looks like. So you can still find old trees and forests that were where naval stores were harvested. So basically cuts were made in the bark, and they started up high with these diagonal cuts, which would then funnel resin and allow it to drip into a bucket below. So you would cut this each year, right? And then the tree would eventually heal itself. So you'd have to make a new cut. And so over time, it sort of produced this herringbone pattern, sometimes called cat face scars because of the little pointy ears up at the top. And then below that, they would use these gutters to direct the resin and then have these clay pots to collect it in. So there's still a few of these trees in the landscape. Most of them are gone. But this is how a lot of resin was collected, and then the resin was used to make different products. So tar is, if you burn logs, right? So once the trees were done, right, they could cut the trees down and bury them underground with this long sloping thing to set them on fire and slowly leach out the sap. And that was used in these features called tar kilns or tarkins, they're sometimes called. And if you're good at looking for them, you can sometimes see where they are in the landscape because of these kind of depressions, and then they're surrounded by a little or there's a little mound that's surrounded by a depression. And tar was incredibly valuable in shipbuilding, and also later in roofing. So it produced this thick, sticky substance. Oakum is where you take rope and you pound it into the seams on ships, and then you coat it in tar. So it acts as a preservative and resists decay. And then you can boil the tar to thicken it into pitch if you want that. So that's something that at room temperature, it is solid, but you can heat it to paint onto surfaces for waterproofing. So that was done on the ship's sides to waterproof the wood as it was out at sea. Now, just turpentine was a product that was distilled from this same pine sap. It was used as an illuminant. So this is what people used to light their homes from 1800 to 1860. It was also used in solvents and antiseptics. So, right, so that's where turpentine comes from. And then rosin is a kind of a sticky byproduct from making turpentine. So that's what's left. So this is incredibly difficult labor in order to produce these naval stores products. And unsurprisingly, it was performed by enslaved Africans and African Americans that did all of this labor. And so the economy collapsed after the Civil War. And so that naval stores industry also collapsed. The forests had been harvested for years and years. They can only produce so much. And then another important factor is that for illumination, kerosene became more popular. So turpentine was no longer sold in hundreds of thousands of barrels. So today, less than 3% of longleaf pine forest remains of the former 90 million acres. And that's a really notable number that this is a forest type that is quite rare, that we've been, that now there are efforts underway to restore it. Looking at longleaf pine restoration, the Longleaf Coalition partners with the North Carolina Forest Service to promote restoration projects and also provide expertise. So a lot of places like Croatan National Forest is one of them. At the Hoffman, we have longleaf pine planted because of the legacy of longleaf pine. It is a really important and unique and historic forest type. So it is a priority in many places now. One other thing in the historical use, after the Civil War, railroads were built, and this is something you can read about. There's a wonderful book called Looking for Longleaf that talks about the history of longleaf pine. And these temporary railroad lines were put down, and they would go into these forests, especially deep in the deep South, Alabama, the Piney Woods area, and they would just cut huge swaths of longleaf pine trees. So once they were exhausted for naval stores and slavery ended, they were then harvested at an incredibly fast rate because of steam locomotion. So that's a little bit more about longleaf pine and other pine forest types in the southeastern coastal plain. We talked about the species composition, and this will be the similar structure for all of our forest type lectures, right? We'll talk about the forest structure, right? What that forest stand looks like, the environmental factors that are important in determining that that's the kind of forest that we have, and then also any kind of disturbance regime. Sometimes we'll talk about threats as well. And today's focus was on longleaf pine and the natural history and also historic properties. And that's a wrap.